is Dominic Catone. I'm with Ferguson Partners as the Senior Managing Director of our Leadership Consulting practice. I'm very excited here today to be able to talk about a very important topic, I think, both to our organizations and our communities, is really kind of conversations around race and gender. I have with me today some extraordinary individuals who I am exceptionally proud to know as a part of my own personal network, as well as my professional network, here to discuss some of the issues that are top of mind today as it relates to race and gender across our organizations and our communities. Before we get started, though, I wanted to take the opportunity to really have them introduce themselves a little bit and some of their kind of viewpoint or experiences that they have associated with our topic today. So I'd actually like to start with Dr. Rachel Talton to introduce herself, and then we will go ahead and introduce the others.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to you, Dominic, as one of my newest, very best friends and most wonderful colleagues in this industry. Thanks to Ferguson Partners for having all of us. And thank you to these amazing, brilliant, badass, incredible young ladies, Lena and Carrie. So my name is Dr. Rachel Yvonne Talton. I guess the most interesting thing about me is that my PhD is in the area of trust. So I do a lot of thinking about how leaders earn trust, how they maintain it, and how they repair it when it's been broken. Another interesting thing about me is that I've been in business for 20 years. Synergy International Limited has been around for 20 years. I'm a recovered banker, if that makes any of you giggle, and took this leap of faith to entrepreneurism and have never looked back. We started our company really to help organizations to figure out sort of that synergy between how do we deliver on the promises of our brand to our customers? How do we understand their met and unmet needs? How do we ensure that our employees have the tools and resources to deliver against that promise? And then how do we, of course, continue to be a going concern by turning a profit? Diversity, equity, and inclusion had always been a part of our work. Our first client was actually Kent State University that called us up to complete their diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. But it had always just been a small part of our business. I'd always called it my God job, quite frankly. And then George Floyd passed away. And so many things changed for so many, but for me, my God job immediately became my day job. And I have a master's, a PhD, I have all this school, and I went back to school to Cornell to become educated on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today, I would say that probably 85% of the work that we're doing is in the area of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Still, of course, a researcher, still the foundation is trust, but how do we help people become better human beings? And how do we help organizations to really promote that by doing the work of being inclusive organizations? So that's a little bit about me. Thank you so much again for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm so excited to learn more from you today over this next hour that we have together, especially around your background in trust, which we'll get to in a little while as well. But I want to next up give Lena the opportunity to share a little bit about herself as well as her experiences too. So Lena.
Thank you. I am honored and excited and delighted to be here. Thank you all for organizing this, and to my powerhouse panelists, what a thrill. My name is Lena Abarafi. I am a feminist, activist, former humanitarian aid worker, accidental academic, all sorts of things. Women's rights is what gets me up every day. It is how I start my day. It is why I start my day. My present position is as executive director of the Arab Institute for Women, which is based out of the Lebanese American University. And what's amazing about this place is that it's almost 50 years old, 50, which means that it's the very first in the region, in the Arab region. And you don't hear these kinds of things coming out of the region very often, unfortunately. So I think that counters some expectations and maybe defies some stereotypes about what people think of the Arab region. But also, being almost 50 years old, that makes it one of the oldest academic institutes dedicated to women in the world. So it's an incredible little place, working at the intersection of academia and activism. So it's a perfect fit for me. I've been there for 6 years at the helm, and before that, did about 2 decades of work in humanitarian emergencies trying to end sexual violence. And as you're probably already thinking, my track record is terrible because I've never ended sexual violence anywhere, not in any of the 20-some countries that I've lived and worked in. Places like Afghanistan, Mali, Haiti, Nepal, Chad, Congo, Sierra Leone, Central African Republic. I mean, the list goes on. But what I've done is taken on an impossible task. I couldn't even end it in this neighborhood where I am, on my street, in this house. It is unfortunately one of the worst byproducts of humanity. It is the most egregious crime. It is the longest running human rights violation. It is what makes me sick and makes me angry. And what I really want to talk about is the power of anger, actually, because as somebody who was born at the intersection of different cultures, different religions, different countries, different contexts, I spent my youth feeling very nomadic, totally uprooted. I'm Lebanese and Palestinian already. That's enough. That's complicated enough. I grew up between Saudi Arabia and the United States, also pretty complicated. So all of these are, for me, ways that I never took my identity for granted because I had to negotiate everything at every turn. You grew up with a lot of hyphens in your identity, and you really have to critically think about who you are and what that means, and what you own and why. So I think identity is a very fascinating political project that is constantly changing. But all of that to say, my identity as a woman was the thing that really lit my fire. And I started to notice things and ask things, question things. And then when I was 14, I took a course called Comparative Women's History. And it wasn't actually about women's history. It was about the history of violence against women that's been committed in every country, every space, every culture, every time, even here, now, there, where you are, where I am, all the time. And I thought, that's it. I can't sleep at night. Here's my 14-year-old head spinning. And that's it. That's basically what I've been doing ever since. And all I know is that it's going to take 100 years more, actually, to achieve equality. I personally will not be around to see that. I don't think. Maybe my fellow panelists are more optimistic about their lifespan. I want someone to see it and tell me that we've succeeded. But really, I want us to just speed up. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah. No, your fiery commitment and your passion and your courage and the strength of your convictions, I just am so grateful and thankful to have you here with us today. And I can't wait to hear more from you as we go. And then I want to also give Carrie the opportunity to share a little bit about her background as well. And some of the things that keep you up at night, Carrie, related to your background as well.
All right, Dominic, thank you for the invitation. It's such an honor and a privilege to be on this panel. I'm Carrie Tirado-Brayman. I'm a professor of English at the University of Buffalo, and I teach classes on Latinx literature, on American pluralism, and on creative nonfiction. And I'm also the director of the Gender Institute at the University of Buffalo, which promotes research on issues related to women, gender, and sexuality. And I'm the author of 2 books, most recently American Niceness, A Cultural History, that Harvard published a few years ago. And to get us started in our conversation, I'd like to share with you an anecdote from graduate school. And it's actually an experience that my husband had when he first arrived in the United States to study at Stanford. He is from Devon, England, which is a very homogeneous part of the country, for those of you who know the UK. And when he arrived in the Bay Area, he was immediately struck by its diversity and its multilingualism. And just going about his daily routine, grocery shopping and walking along the streets, he heard different languages all around him. And he found this daily exposure to different cultures really exhilarating and a dramatic contrast to what he experienced growing up in Devon. But he soon found out that others felt differently. And one of his undergraduates at Stanford said openly in class that he found the diversity of the Bay Area really bewildering. Now, he was from a homogeneous community in the United States, and when he arrived at Stanford and heard different languages around him on campus and off campus, he he imagined that they were talking about him. So other students in the classroom nodded their heads in agreement. So this anecdote that I'm sharing with you shows how our response to diversity is a matter of attitude. Where my husband David embraced this exposure to cultural difference, his student reacted to the same experience with defensiveness, fear, and even a bit of paranoia. They are speaking about me. So how we frame encounters with others affects our attitude, our behavior, and the decisions we make personally and professionally. And depending on your point of view, the same thing can be seen as a problem, a threat for the student, or an opportunity. So I just want to pose some questions. What does it mean to think of diversity as an opportunity? And how do we respond in a spirit of openness rather than defensiveness? And I just want to offer this, that one way to answer these questions is to stress the importance of cultural humility, that we remain curious and humble about difference all of our lives. We are on a continuous learning journey when it comes to respecting and embracing other people's experiences and realities. So I just want to get us started, Dominic, by sharing that story.
That's what I think is going to really help all of us really kind of understand the concepts better, is our ability to hear stories, the storytelling and the exposure that we get, the engagement that we have with people from different backgrounds who have different experiences, that if we're open, we're able to bring those in and really make those experiences a part of our own experiences, a part of our own humanity, right? And I think one of those ways, one of the things that we need to talk about as we talk about these types of issues is just in general trust, that we are able to kind of build with one another, how we establish that trust, how do we actually gain trust in the way that we operate with others. And I thought, how we further establish that across different populations of people. I know, Dr. Rachel, this has been kind of an area of expertise for you. You spent a great deal of your time in this area. Maybe you can talk us through some of the kind of the tenets of trust and how we might actually continue to establish that foundation so that people can openly share and experience and hear and tell the stories that are so critical to the content of which we're discussing today.
Well, thank you so much, Dominic, for that question, and thank you, Carrie, for that story. It really brings home the diversity of the way that we think, right? Just those two individuals, your husband and his classmate, the diversity of thinking, and that diversity of thinking increases the likelihood that there's going to be a difference between how they respond to diversity, to inclusion, to change writ large. So Dominic, to answer your question, which is a great one, because the intersection of inclusion and trust is huge. We cannot have inclusion without it. As a matter of fact, we can't have business relations without trust. We can't have personal relations without trust. Trust is really sort of that foundation that builds all relationships, right? And that's one of the reasons that I studied it as a recovered banker. I was in the sales side of the business, the marketing side of the business, and I was bringing in thousands, literally, of customers to our very large. I worked for the 12th largest bank in the country at that time, bringing in all these customers, and they would leave through the back door. I'm like, wait a second, what's happening here? Why? How can we build a beloved company? We say that we're these things. That's how I got them here, by promising them that they were going to get X, Y, and Z. And what happened is that we lost their trust because we didn't deliver what we promised, right? And so I went to Case Western Reserve University and I said, I need to figure out how to build a beloved company, and I can't find any literature on it. So I'm just going to write about it myself. I need to get a PhD in this. And the head of the department was like, how to develop a beloved company. Yes, sir. That's what I want to study. Of course, that ended up, we of course all want to boil the ocean. That ended up being we can't sort of create love, but we can create trust, right? We can become trustworthy. And the way in which we do that is very important. So first of all, the definition of trust. And again, the intersection of trust and inclusion, you'll see that sort of weave its way through our conversation throughout. The definition of trust is the willingness to be vulnerable. So when I trust you, you can hurt me. The willingness to be vulnerable, right? And so the other side of that is trustworthiness. And that's kind of where we focus. That's where we can control how we behave. And there are three particular tenets of trustworthiness. The first is benevolence. When I think about benevolence, I think of my grandmother who had 19 children. She was married to a sharecropper. They lived in the southern part of Arkansas, so you can imagine the racism that they experienced was just absolutely horrific. And when I say 19 kids, no twins, just 19 individual children my grandmother had with no money, no resources. But what they did have was love of God, their faith, their love of community, and their love for education. And so even though their kids half the time didn't have books, their teachers were sometimes pretty awful to them, but sometimes they'd have that one teacher that really invested in them. And of those 19 kids that grew up in a cotton field that didn't belong to my grandfather, who died at 107 years old about 5 years ago, 11 of them are lawyers, including my mom. And so when we talk about benevolence, this notion of putting the needs of others before yourself, that's what benevolence means. So one of the ways in which you earn the trust of people is to show them that you empathize with them, that you put their needs before your own, or at least on par with your own, that you're here to help them. So that's one way in which you earn trustworthiness. Now, as much as I loved my grandma, who passed away when I was 16, and who is with me today and every single day, who drives me every day, I wouldn't trust her to do my taxes. Why? Because she only finished the 8th grade, right? And so that brings me to the next level of trust. You can trust people on one dimension and not necessarily on the other. And as businesses and as leaders, we need to earn trust across all three. The second dimension of trust is competency, right? Can you fulfill? Do you have the skills, talents, abilities, education to fulfill the needs of what is put in front of you? So, for example, if I need surgery, I'm going to look for that surgeon's competencies. Does he know what he's doing? What kind of education does he have? What kind of physical skills does he have? What kind of habits does he keep, right? Those are sort of the levels of competency. But I might trust that surgeon to provide me surgery and not trust him to watch my nieces, because I don't necessarily know his values. I just know his competency, which leads us to the third dimension of trustworthiness, which is integrity. And when I say integrity in this instance, I mean shared values, right? And so do I share the values of this individual? Can I show that sharing of values in my actions, in my words, in my deeds? Am I honest and trustworthy and transparent, right? And so I often tell the story about The Sopranos, right? If you've ever seen The Sopranos, and Tony Soprano, who was, of course, a gangster, had his group of men who worked for him. If he went out and told somebody to go break someone's legs or do some other awful thing to them, he trusted that individual was going to do that. So it doesn't necessarily mean high moral standards, right? It means shared values. They share the same values, right? And so that's a really important piece of this. You want to ensure each of us wants to have high moral standards, and I believe that we all do, right? But everybody doesn't, right? And so understanding where your values lie and where the other individual's values lie is very important. And then understanding that place in which you have shared values and where there's a differentiation of values. And so that's kind of, when you think about building trust across these three dimensions: benevolence, competence, and integrity and or shared values, really being that trustworthy individual makes you, therefore, to Carrie's earlier point, open to hearing about, to being curious about. As Carrie was speaking, I literally saw the IDI continuum in my head, right? Going from denial to adaptation. This notion of cultural competency, its foundation again is in trust. And so when you trust humanity and you trust yourself, then you are open to hearing other languages and eating other foods and loving every single person, no matter who they love or what their religion or race or creed.
I mean, that was an extraordinary kind of even just the definition of trust, right? I think we've got there's so many definitions out there, but to be able to pull these things together in a way that is truly kind of understandable, and from the stories that we tell, right, that have kind of articulated what these mean to us, I think is so critically important, especially that piece around shared values. So it's what I talk about with leaders all the time is, if you're leaving an organization, what are your organizational values? How are those things actually really kind of channeled through your behaviors and the things that you do and the things that you believe in? And what are those messages that are associated with some of those values? And I think as we talk about race and gender here today, what's important is, again, like I said, the stories, the communication, the messages that we share with others. And so what I want to open up to the wider group is, why does language matter, right? Why is it important for us to use the power of communication and the power of language to talk about race and gender in authentic ways with each other? I'm gonna throw that out to the group, and whoever wants to answer that, please. It's a big question. Go for it.
Lena, did you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I'll start with a few minutes. I mean, my thoughts are that language is a beautiful, powerful tool that evolves. If you look at identities and how we understand who we are and what we need and what we want, and how we present ourselves to the world, we are building the language as we experience it. We are allowing it to change as we change so that we understand different dimensions of ourselves. I mean, we're multidimensional beings, and so we live these really rich and full lives. And I think we need the language to keep up with us as we negotiate all those different identities. One thing I want to say about words and their meaning is, they're obviously very political and very charged, and they take on different values at different times. I worked in Afghanistan and lived there for 4 years and did my doctoral research while I was working. I was running an international NGO for women. And I really looked at the words that we use for women's rights, for gender, for liberation, for all of those things, and what they mean and what power those words hold at certain times for Afghans themselves, because at the end of the day, I mean, they're the ones who are implicated in it, and we're accountable to them. And I loved, Dr. Rachel, what you said about trust, because it's so much about that. Do you have integrity? Are you delivering? Do you have the competence? All of those things. So for Afghans, even a word like gender had not yet been translated or integrated into their languages, into Dari or Pashto. And so you would say, whatever you say in their local languages, and the word gender, you would say in English, because there just wasn't any understanding of the nuance of that word, which has evolved also over time based on our own understandings of power and the range of gender identities and expressions and all of the richness that word now conveys. And what I studied was the different aspects of people's identities and how those have more or less sway over who they are at different times. And that is when those identities are challenged. So in a case like Afghanistan, do you feel like you are a citizen of this country? Do you feel like sex is the most important identity? Do you feel like religion, in that case Islam, is the most important identity for you? Do you feel like your ethnic identity, all of these different tribal groups, is that what is salient? And what they told me was so interesting, and that is, if you challenge or question or try and change or define for somebody else what those identities mean, you will ignite that fire, and you will make those aspects of people's identities important, under threat, and they will defend them, and they will become more salient as a result. And it was such a fascinating way that language works, and identities work, and the politics that underlie all that. So that's what I was thinking very much as you were speaking, Dr. Rachel, about trust and how difficult all of that is when you don't give people a chance to define for themselves who they are and what they want. And I think we're seeing that in so many different aspects around the world and different places. And maybe finally we're opening up to the real diversity that we've deserved all along.
I love the way you position that. Oh, sorry, Dr. Rachel. No,
yeah,
you go.
I was just going to say that that also seems to be a thread, not only the sort of distance between the ability to trust others, but also this notion of trusting yourself. Going back again to Carrie's story, right? This person was so wrapped up in himself, but didn't really trust himself enough to think, well, why don't I go ask them what they're talking about? Right? Why don't I reach out a hand to them? And so very interesting comment, Lena.
Well, and as we talk about identity, I think, there's so many things that make us who we are, right? So for me personally, as a member of the LGBTQ population, yes, I'm a man. I'm of Sicilian descent, right? My whole family is from Sicily. But I'm a gay male. And I've worked in, lots of different industries, financial services and real estate, and I've had all sorts of different experiences. I've had individuals throughout my lifetime who required the exposure to me to better understand their own biases. And the fact that, hey, you know what? My son is gay, my nephew is gay, my whatever it might be is gay, whatever the interaction I had with them. And because of who I was and because of the way that I shared my experiences with them, hopefully I was able to open them up more so to the things that they didn't necessarily see about their own biases. And so, but at the same time, I also see myself as a Generation Xer, right? I mean, I come from a different generation. I think a lot of us traverse different generations. We try our best to understand the different generational differences. But I think there is so much to learn from the younger generations that are emerging, that are really kind of advocating for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations, their institutions, their communities. And so I guess my question to the group here is, what can we learn from the various generations? And at the same time, how does that inform a bit more about our biases, or the way that those biases actually translate into the way that we act or operate? I don't know if Carrie wants to go.
Yeah.
Or...
I've been thinking about this a lot because as an educator at the university, this is Generation Z is precisely the generation I'm educating right now. And I just finished this book, Gen Z 360 by Hannah Ben Shabbat, just published this year. 1998 to 2016 are sort of the bookends for the generation. And it's really an amazing generation, not just because I have two daughters in that generation, but because, for example, Cheerios has an ad featuring an interracial gay couple. And, young people don't bat an eye at it. They grow up with Beyonce and the Broadway hit of Hamilton, that diversity is assumed. And what I'm hearing now from students, and Shabbat also makes this point in her book, is that this generation is uncomfortable with ticking boxes, with categorizing identity. They want identity to exceed boxes, whether it's racial or sexual. So people aren't identifying exclusively as gay or straight now, but pansexual, bisexual, demisexual, and having very open discussions about it. And so sexuality is more fluid, and this also applies to gender. 59% of Gen Zers believe that we need to think of gender identity beyond the man-woman binary. So, which is incredible, right? Almost 60%. So this generation is asking us to rethink binaries in really fundamental ways and to rethink identity beyond boxes.
Oh yeah. Can I build on that?
Sure.
You know, in the Arab region, what is so interesting is it's a very young population, and the way that they are dealing with all of the different insecurities, protracted crises, economic issues, government dysfunction, resurgence of patriarchy, all of those different challenges, is that they are rising up in ways that are organic, intersectional by nature, regional, without even trying. I mean, it's so beautiful in that it's not even deliberate. It's not even done in a conscious way. It's just how they think and how they exist in the world, and how they take on their own issues and each other's in ways that really defy this sense of like the old guard and the traditional kind of leadership and the old school, let's say old school feminists who work with an NGO or are within an understood structure. They do not want to be a part of it. They see themselves as completely peripheral to it. They want to take on any issues that they feel passionate about. They channel the power of anger in ways that I think are amazing. And they're so inspiring. They're absolutely right. I mean, they're teaching us how they view identities, what that means. And we have to kind of keep up with that, which I think is fantastic. And one thing that I have been doing really consciously since I've taken on this position, partly because they've taught me, is to ask them, what do you need from me? You know, I'm the older generation. I'm grandma feminist. Like, what can I do to help you? How can I serve what you are doing? You all tell me how I can help you take this forward. And, well, you know, I believe that you are going to finish what we have not been able to finish, right? And I think it's just been such a wonderful exchange and such a rich experience.
Yeah, and you know, both of you, what powerful statements about our youth, which give me so much hope. They give me so much hope. I'm already a woman of faith, but these young people give me so much hope. You know, we have 5 generations in the workplace. We've never had that before. Never before in history, Carrie, you can attest. We've never had 5 generations in the workplace before. So now today we do, which is a powerful thing. Now on the corporate side, the interesting thing, and we have experienced 3 pandemics. We haven't talked about that yet, but just saying out loud, obviously we are partially coming out of COVID with the asterisks of the Delta variant, which, you know, is unfortunately still taking lives. So we have the healthcare pandemic, we have the racial pandemic, which is still being navigated here in America and around the world. And we also have an economic pandemic, which, again, we haven't talked about, but the socioeconomic status of individuals and how that plays a role in the way that we think, and the intersectionality there is very important. But when I think about young people, we're talking about going back to the workplace. Somewhere around 60% of young people are like, I don't think I want to go back to the workplace. Or I don't want to go back to the office, right? I can work from here. I can work from a beach. I don't need to be in a box in order to do my job. And so again, the ideas of the younger, generations are teaching us, to your point, Lena, about how to live, how to think, and about really showing up with your values, not just performatively, not just talking about them, but actually being about them. And to your point, also organically showing up. So young people give us so much hope. And they will, Lena, to your point, they will finish the work that all of us have started, and God bless them for doing so.
Exactly. What we do at the Institute is whenever we have these panels or presentations, speakers, conferences, whatever stuffy kind of conventional events we might have, is we'll put a young person on the panel with the minister or with the head of this agency or with the CEO of whatever, and we'll give them equal time, or we'll give the young person even more time. And it is extraordinary to see how they address what is the kind of traditional understanding of power with courage, with conviction, with passion. They don't mince their words. They don't shy away from it. They step up and they take it on. And there I am, hooting and cheering like I'm at a rock concert and like throwing papers up in the air saying, that's it, I'm going to retire, with great joy. Because my goal is to work myself out of a job, right? I mean, this is a rotten job that nobody should have. You know, fixing a mess of ending violence against women is not a career. It should be common sense. And I hate that I even have this kind of a job. There are a million other things I could do. So if these are the people who are going to take this on and point fingers where they deserve to be, that gets me closer to retirement. And I don't know, maybe it's origami or I don't know, chicken herding or something else.
Wine drinking in the wine country.
Right. I mean, I really, honestly, this conversation is just, I'm brimming with ideas and kind of, and specific thoughts around, I mean, just weaving in the concept of legacy, right? Lena, what you're talking about is like, what's the legacy that you're leaving that you know that people shouldn't have to pick up, but they will. And that ultimately, like, there's so many amazing things that are going to happen off the back end of that legacy and that contribution. In conjunction with Dr. Rachel, what you were talking about with, you know, organizations and making sure that it's just not performative, right? That we're actually having authentic conversations about these types of things within our entities. And so I guess my next question for the group is, how can we have real dialogue around race and gender where it's truly authentic, right? I think people right now are very nervous. I think they're very concerned about if they're going to say or do the wrong thing as it relates to some of these harder topics, right? And if organizations and communities were going to at least start to initially have some of those conversations, what are some of the things that they should do that helps to continue to cultivate this level of authenticity, which is what we need in our language across our organizations and communities?
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I've got 2 seconds and I promise you can mute me. But what I want to say is ask people, you know, and it's something that sounds so simple. It's a no-brainer, but we don't do it. Having come from 2 decades of humanitarian experience, we hardly ever ask the people who are implicated, the people who are suffering, the people who are in the middle of a conflict or in the aftermath of a natural disaster, what do you need and how can we help you? And from the perspective of someone who worked on sexual violence, I would ask women, do you feel safe? Knowing that the answer was by and large going to be no. And my follow-up question, what will it take to make you feel safe? And just the act of asking someone, what do you need? How do you want me to help you? Is already transformative in the sense that people know what they want. They have agency and they will articulate it. One great example is the text messaging that we in New York received at the onset of COVID, which was stay home, stay safe. We got that 5 times a day for about 6 weeks. And those of us who work in this field know that there's something naive about that message. It is incomplete. It makes assumptions, and it is dangerous because when you say stay home so you can stay safe, it assumes that home is safe, and it isn't the case for a lot of people, a lot of women who are in situations of intimate partner violence, new situations. The point is that nobody asked if that message was okay or what message we should craft that would be better, more considerate, more reflective of the diversity of people's experience and their lived realities. We just didn't ask. So for 6 weeks, we were inundated with stay home, stay safe. And then somewhere around the 7th week, someone else got hold of the text messaging service and they said, well, home isn't safe for everyone. So if you're feeling unsafe, here's a number, here's a website. And we all thought, okay, that's good that somebody caught on to this, but did we have to wait 6 weeks? It's obvious that you just didn't ask. And that's the point. Just ask people and they will tell you exactly. And I think there's so much power in that. And then there's ownership.
And ownership, I mean, is anyone willing to go there with ownership, right? Because I think ownership that's a critical part of this conversation, right?
Yeah, and I will, and then you can mute me as well. We have a model, and I'll just quickly share it with you. It's really easy. It's called LEAP, right? It's about, you're talking about having a real conversation and then doing the work. It's not enough to talk about it. It's not enough to write letters and pretty, Black Lives Matter statements, 10 months ago, and you haven't seen literally a Black, brown, gay, you know, individual in their leadership at all, right? And so really looking at diversity in leadership. So that's the L. Really looking at the strategy and making sure that that strategy really meets their values, and to Lena's point, really asking people throughout each of these of this acronym we're talking about, asking people and ensuring that we are listening to their responses and then responding to them with actions. Okay, so the E is for engagement. We already know that engaged employees, just like engaged students and engaged individuals, are more likely to show up as their whole selves and be passionate about the work. So ensuring that people are engaged and that you're sourcing and recruiting in ways that are diverse and inclusive. The A is for advancement. So how are you doing succession planning? How are you doing career pathing? So many times I hear we can't find a diverse individual for this role or that role. Bullshit. Pardon my French. Yes, that's not true, and I don't care what the role is, right? But the intentionality has to be there. The mindset, as Carrie was talking about earlier, has to be there in order to make change that is not just performative. And then the P is for positioning. So that's about how do you engage your external marketplace? How do you talk to people? What does your marketing look like? What kinds of conversations are you having? Are you, to Lena's point, asking people over and over again what it is that they need, whether or not they're happy, what they think about your brand? Now, to your point about ownership, and that's a whole nother that's a whole nother dissertation and conversation. But the science of ownership, the idea that each and every one of us owns this conversation around inclusion, that owns this conversation not only around race and gender, but across the 36 dimensions of diversity that exist in our communities and society. We each own where we are today, and we can each own where we will be tomorrow. And which is why I again have so much hope in young people, because they aren't afraid. I think older generations were afraid to have these conversations and afraid of retribution. They don't care. You fire me, I'll start my own business, right? They're just unafraid. And so ownership is really important when you're talking about not just being performative, but actually stepping up to the plate and committing to these actions. So I think LEAP is really important, or whatever you want to call it, however you want to say it. I don't care. Just really look at these elements within your organization and within your family, within your church, and within all of our institutions, and then own up to the results. Look at yourself and think about, what can I do to make this situation better?
Yeah,
Carry on. Okay.
Yeah, I would just add, as an educator, I've been teaching American pluralism, but also issues of race, class, and gender in all different contexts. And these conversations are messy. And sometimes one loses control of them as well. And I take Dr. Rachel's point about vulnerability, because in this context, often the moderator or the professor has to be the one to listen. And you don't know where the conversation may go. So I had one amazing discussion with students. This was in 2000, when the language wasn't as polished. So actually, conversations around 2000, the late 1990s, were really raw. And we were reading Baldwin, James Baldwin, and I had a student from the east side of Buffalo, African-American woman, who said, "I am so full of rage at the injustice that I've witnessed in my family and in my community, that sometimes I want to kill white people." It just came out, and so all of a sudden the white students with their baseball caps and sweatshirts, I remember one to just withdrew and just shut. The baseball cap went down and wouldn't engage. And here she was so vulnerable and angry at the same time, and it's a messy space, and that's a good thing. I want to just say we have to go through the ugliness of the violence, of the hurt that has been witnessed and experienced in order to come out the other side. So it's okay to allow these moments to happen and to stay with those moments and to have other students in the class be uncomfortable. That's part of the process of being with that discomfort.
I love that, Carrie. Oh, my God.
That's such an amazing contribution to this conversation, because I think where it brings us to is, again, kind of the exposure, really getting inside someone else's shoes, right? Really trying to hear from their lens and their perspective, and that their perspective might not be what you want to hear, right? It might not necessarily be as gentle as you would like to hear it, right? And that sometimes we need to go through that challenging conversation together to get out on the other end with a little more understanding and empathy, right? And so I want to ask that question around, we talk a good game around empathy. I mean, empathy this year during the pandemic was like the word of the year, right? And the reality is that I think we're moving more towards empathetic and compassionate behaviors, especially in organizations. I'm seeing more and more leaders really focus on this. But I guess my question to all of you is, how do we develop greater empathy and compassion, right? What are some of the steps or the things that we need to do off the back of what Carrie said here in our conversation today, that we can continue to make sure that it's not just a word that we're tossing around, but actually something that we value and that we demonstrate with each other?
For me, there's listening to what people are saying, right? The real act of listening to what they say, but also to trying to reflect, look inward a little bit and understand why they are saying it. And even if it comes out, to Carrie's point, to something really raw or something that seems to be offensive or unpolished or whatever, why would somebody feel that way and say those things? Try and understand, knowing that you will never fully be able to empathize. You are not in their shoes, and it is so hard to say that you fully understand. You really don't. But as much as you can, from one human to another, to understand what underlies the words that they say and what their experience might be, and try and see how that might make you feel. And I think that's really challenging. It's kind of a reminder to all of us all the time, because it's so easy to just be lazy. It's so easy to default into taking offense, being defensive, misunderstanding. It happens so quickly, and we're living in an age where everything is taken out of context. I mean, we speak in acronyms, we speak in social media blips, anything that I say that you take out of context could turn into something completely different. So these are kind of dangerous and scary times, and I think it keeps people quiet in many ways. And I think what we really need to understand is to look at things in their totality, understand who is saying what they are saying, why they are saying it, look at the whole context as much as you can, because otherwise you're making a snap judgment and it does a huge disservice. You'll never achieve any understanding that way.
I love that. I just, the only thing that I would add to that is so I believe that empathy is my superpower, right? Everybody has a superpower. Each one of you has one, and that's a whole nother panel discussion. But mine, I think, is empathy. I saw the movie Sybil when I was 6 years old. I know I wasn't supposed to be watching it. My mom yelled at me at the time, but I wanted to sort of jump through the TV and hug her and put her back together. I didn't understand what that meant or what psychology was. I probably never even heard the word psychology at the time. But that same little girl gets up, to Lena's point, every single day working to eradicate racism, sexism, misogyny, and all of the isms, right? I wake up that same little girl is doing the work of empathy. So I would just say, from my perspective, just looking at the two kinds of empathy, affective empathy, which is really speaking to what Lena said, really getting into not only how people feel, but feeling it yourself, and understanding that context of what they're feeling and why they're feeling it. That's affective empathy. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is perspective taking. And I think that sometimes we miss one side or the other. And I try to work on, because I believe it's my superpower, I try to work that muscle, because there are a lot of things that I'm not so good at, right? I try to really get into the feelings that people have and the perspectives and the lived experience that they have, and understand as best I can, because to Lena's point, you can't fully understand anyone else's lived experience, but also to have cognitive empathy, to take the perspective that they have and to try to understand why they have those perspectives. So that's all I would add to Lena's wonderful comments.
Yeah, and what I would add to that too is, what Lena said about listening, and to listen to our own patterns of defensiveness and reactivity, because we all have them. And these encounters can teach us how to respond to the world rather than merely react to it. And in the classroom, I really prefer compassion, because it's empathy with the need to resolve it, to intervene, to act. And so, for example, a student stopped coming to my class. This was early on in the semester, a young woman in the back. I could have reacted by saying, oh, she hates me. She doesn't like my class. I'm going to write her and tell her about the policy of attendance. Instead, I decided to write her because the professor, like a leader in a corporation, sets the tone, right, with ethical leadership, compassionate leadership. And I said, are you okay? I've missed seeing you in class. Giving her, in other words, the benefit of a doubt. And she wrote back saying, oh, I'm so glad you reached out to me. I was so afraid to write to you, but I've had to take care of my elderly grandfather because my mother's working. So she lives in a multi-generational home, and a lot of Gen Zers are living in multi-generational homes. She comes from a working class background, and she's a young woman, so she was dumped with the elder care where her brother wasn't. And she just couldn't negotiate that schedule. So it was really heartbreaking at one level, because she said, I'm so angry that I'm the one that has to do this, because I'm so looking forward to college, and this is my first semester. But we were able to work through it, and she was able to resolve the schedule with her mother, and she did an excellent job in class and didn't miss another day. But this is an example of compassionate leadership, where you sort of broach it, not assuming hostility, but communication.
Well, it's so interesting you brought this up, because I think oftentimes that defensiveness, coupled with the assumptions that we make about other people's lived experiences or their challenges or their disappearances, right, could actually hinder our ability to make change happen here, right? And so I guess my question, my final question to all of you on our panel today is, what is the progress we're not making, and how do we change that? And I'm just going to open it up to the wider group. Anyone want to take on that meaty question?
I'll jump in, and I'll offer this, that as an educator in teaching these issues, you don't necessarily know the outcome. Measuring the outcome is really, really difficult, because the students come in, in September and they leave in December. They seem like the same kids, right? But I received an email last week from a student in my class in 2002 who now has a PhD in pharmaceutical science. And he wrote me out of the blue saying, thank you for that class on American pluralism back in 2002. I came from a rural community in upstate New York, and I'd never talked about race, class, gender, sexuality before. I never knew you could talk about these issues. And he said, it really changed my life, and it shaped the way I do research in pharmaceutical science and the way I'm raising my son. Now, I'm not, these letters, believe me, are very rare, so I treasured that one, because you often don't ever hear from students again. But I just want to say, and I want to encourage companies, that the investment in diversity may not pay off very quickly, that this is for the long duration. This is a long-term investment, but it is worthwhile because you will reap the dividends, literally and figuratively, by creating a workforce that is more motivated, and you will retain members of the workforce more, which is a huge issue right now. And people will enjoy working together. It just creates a healthier environment. So my advice is, this investment is long-term, and you may not reap the benefits in the short term, but it's well worth it to wait.
To Carrie's point, any change takes 11 to 13 months. The science tells us that you can't, they may tell you can lose 20 pounds in 3 days. It's not going to happen, or it's not going to stay off. So sustainable change takes time. And so what I like to look for are those incremental changes that are sustainable, making sure that they're not just a flash in the pan changes, but that those changes are long lasting. And again, I'm going to go back to our multi-generational workforce, right? Really holding us to account, because they're not going to stick around for organizations who don't live their values. They will not, retention is going to be far more difficult if these organizations do not live their values, do not understand their values, do not communicate their values, do not show up with their values, putting both their wallet and their time. So what does your checkbook look like, and what does your calendar look like? That's what's important to you, no matter what you say. And then and making sure that you're making those investments, to Carrie's point, for the long haul. And one more thing, diversity prediction theorem. I'll just throw that out there. So to Carrie's point, Carrie made some really poignant points. Diversity prediction theorem tells us that the more diversity and inclusion that we have, the better the responses, the better the answers, the better the innovation that we come up with when we have differences of background, lived experience, education, race, gender, etc. So, the way that we know we've made changes is when we see that diversity, when we feel that diversity, when the checkbooks and calendars show that diversity.
Lena, any other additional thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you ask us what's the progress we're not making, and I ask, what is the goal, right? For me, it's freedom, it's equality, it's rights, it's respect, it's dignity. I think that's a really important word. And again, using the lens that how I see the world, I view it through the lens of safety. Do we have a right to be anywhere, anytime, any place, in any outfit, in any configuration, accessing any of the unlimited options of the human experience, just like everybody else does? Are we safe to do that? And safety is not the end. It's really the starting point. But again, from the perspective of violence against women, which is my unfortunate lens through which I see the world, if you ask about unwanted touching, or about the lack of consent, or the denial of bodily autonomy and integrity, I mean, we're still dealing with those kinds of issues where we're not safe to walk alone at night on the street, or we have to carry our keys in our hand, or we have to call our friends when we get home. I mean, these are limiting our lives, constricting us, restricting our mobility, denying our freedom. And as long as we don't have that as a very basic starting point, what good is anything else? What good are all the rights that you give me to participate in politics or the economy, education, healthcare, whatever, if I can't even walk outside my house, if I can't even be safe inside my house? And I do this exercise a lot with young women, where I ask, what is the first time? I don't say have you. I say, what's the first time you remember receiving an unwanted touch, a touch you didn't authorize, something you didn't consent to, somebody who violated your bodily autonomy? I was 7. I remember. I have a niece who was 7. So I look at her and I think, I want her to be able to do whatever she wants, anywhere, anytime, in any outfit, with any person, or by herself, and never ever feel like she has to keep herself in check, and never feel like she is responsible for her own safety and she will be blamed if something happens to her. I want her to look at me and think, your ideas are so outdated. We're totally fine. We've got this. I'd like to be a fossil, basically, because as I see it, we've internalized so much of that, denied our own rights and lives and dignity and respect and freedom, and we don't even realize it. We don't even realize how narrow our lives are, and that's not just for violence against women. You can apply that to a lot of other forms of discrimination, but we deliberately have just shrunken our lives to exist with these very narrow parameters, and we cannot continue to do that. So I look to her and I think, all right, that's what I'm working for. It's too late for me. But if she can have full freedom and equality, dignity, rights, respect, everything, all the choice, voice, opportunities, resources, then I can really retire.
Yeah. I mean, that really speaks to a lot of what we discuss in organizations right now around psychological safety. And people feeling like they can bring their whole selves to the workplace without consequence, in feeling secure about who they're worth and their place and their sense of belonging. And those, indeed, the things that we've talked about here today, those are the ambitions, right? Those are the aspirations. Those are the goals. And I'm so grateful to be on this journey with all of you, trying to accomplish these things now and in the future as we go forward. So I just want to thank you very much for your time, your insights, your knowledge, your sense of humor, but at the same time, your courage and conviction around this topic today. Thank you again for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Dominic.